Snow fell without mercy over the Vermont mountains that night, not the gentle kind that settles softly on pine branches, but the heavy, punishing kind that erases roads, swallows sound, and convinces even the bravest creatures to stop moving. The storm had been raging for 3 straight days, turning the forest into a white wall with no beginning and no end. Out there, somewhere beyond the frozen trees, a mother German shepherd pushed forward through the blizzard. One tiny puppy hung from her jaws. 8 more trailed behind her like fading shadows in the snow. She wasn't running away from danger. She was carrying hope straight toward it. Miles away, tucked into the side of the mountain, a small wooden cabin glowed faintly against the storm. Inside, a man sat alone by the fire, boots still on, jacket still zipped, as if he might need to leave at any second. His name was Caleb Rourke, and the war hadn't ended for him. Not really. It still lived behind his eyes, in the way his shoulders stayed tight even when he was sitting, in the way silence felt louder than gunfire ever had. He used to believe the world had already taken everything worth saving from him: his marriage, his sense of purpose, his ability to sleep through the night without waking up ready to fight. He had come to Vermont to disappear, not to be found. Then, through the howl of the wind, came a sound that didn't belong, a faint, uneven scraping against the porch boards. Caleb froze. His body reacted before his mind did. Heart rate steady, breath controlled, muscles awake. The cabin stopped being a cabin and became something else entirely. Another structure, another perimeter, another night where something unknown waited on the other side of the door. The scraping came again, then a pause, then a softer sound, almost a whimper. This wasn't the rhythm of branches or ice. This was alive. When Caleb finally stood and reached for the doorknob, he didn't know what he was more afraid of, what he might find outside, or what part of himself might wake up if he opened that door. The moment he pulled it open, the wind burst in, scattering snow across the floor like shards of glass. And there, framed in the doorway, stood the German shepherd. Her fur was black and tan, soaked and matted with ice. She was strong but thin, ribs faintly visible beneath her coat. In her mouth, she carried a puppy so small it barely looked real. Behind her, in the swirling white, more tiny shapes struggled forward, their legs unsteady, their cries nearly swallowed by the storm. The dog didn't bark. She didn't whine. She didn't beg. She waited. Caleb met her amber gaze, and something in his chest tightened. Not fear, but recognition. He had seen that look before. On the faces of men who had already run out of options. On soldiers who knew retreat wasn't coming, but moved forward anyway. This wasn't desperation. This was resolve. He stepped back and held the door open wider. That single decision, the act of not closing the door, would end up saving 2 lives. Maybe more. And not in the way people usually imagine rescue. Not with sirens or medals or speeches, but with warmth, patience, and the courage to stay present when every instinct tells you to shut down. Here's the truth most people don't like to talk about. In America, we're taught that survival is about toughness, independence, handling things on your own. We celebrate the image of the lone hero, the person who never needs help, the one who pushes through no matter what it costs. But real survival, the kind that lasts, rarely looks like that. Sometimes it looks like a man holding a door open in the middle of a storm, admitting that whatever is out there matters more than his fear of letting it in. The mother dog stepped inside just far enough to place the puppy gently on the rug near the fire. Its body trembled, but it was breathing. She didn't linger. Without hesitation, she turned back into the blizzard, and then she returned again. And again. Each trip slower than the last. Each trip a gamble against exhaustion, cold, and the simple math of survival. Caleb stood by the door the entire time, watching her disappear into white and reappear with another fragile life hanging from her jaws. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stayed. That rhythm out into danger, back into warmth, was something he understood too well. For years, Caleb had been trained to move toward chaos, not away from it. But when the uniform came off and the structure disappeared, no one told him how to stop. No one taught him what to do when the mission ended, but the memories didn't. Like many veterans, he had learned how to survive combat, but not how to survive peace. Statistics don't always make it into stories like this, but they matter. Thousands of former service members live in rural isolation, battling PTSD, depression, and a sense of uselessness that can feel heavier than any rucksack. Caleb was one of them. He wasn't weak, he was exhausted. By the time the last puppy was carried inside, the fire burned low and the storm pressed harder against the walls. The German shepherd stood still for a moment, then lay down and curled her body around her litter, creating a living barrier between them and the cold. Caleb closed the door gently, shutting out the wind. The cabin fell quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft, uneven breathing of 9 tiny lives. Standing there, watching them, Caleb felt something unfamiliar rise up through the numbness he'd been living with. Not happiness, not peace, something smaller but stronger. Responsibility, connection. The realization that staying alive isn't always about protecting yourself. It's about choosing not to abandon what needs you. This is the first lesson of the storm, and it's one we often learn too late. Courage doesn't always look like charging forward. Sometimes it looks like standing still and keeping the door open. Sometimes it looks like letting warmth spill out into the cold, even when you're not sure you have enough to spare. As the snow continued to fall outside, burying the world in silence, Caleb sat down on the floor near the fire, closer than he'd intended. He hadn't planned on being responsible for anyone or anything ever again. But the night didn't ask him for a plan. It asked him for presence. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't turn away. Because this wasn't just the night a dog found shelter. It was the night a man stopped running. And as the storm raged on, both of them unknowingly crossed a line they could never uncross. A line between merely surviving and beginning, slowly, painfully, to live again. Caleb Rourke had not always lived like this, alone on a mountain with a fire that burned more faithfully than most people ever had. Once his life had been measured in missions, in objectives that began and ended cleanly, in brothers who watched his back and a structure that told him exactly who he was. Back then, survival made sense. You stayed alive because someone to your left and right needed you to. You woke up because quitting wasn't an option. Pain was something you postponed. Fear was something you managed. And when it was over, you told yourself you'd deal with the rest later. Later came anyway. Caleb enlisted young, like many men who grew up learning how to endure but never how to rest. He learned early how to carry weight, physical and otherwise. Training stripped him down and rebuilt him into something efficient, disciplined, and lethal when necessary. Years in the Navy SEALs honed those instincts until they lived in his bones. He survived deployments that took pieces of other men with them. He made it home when others didn't. On paper, that made him lucky. In reality, it made him complicated. The first cracks didn't show up in combat. They appeared afterward, quietly, in places no one warns you about. In grocery store aisles when someone dropped a glass jar and his body reacted before his mind could catch up. In traffic when a horn blared and his hands clenched the wheel until his knuckles went white. In bed at night when exhaustion pressed down on him, but sleep refused to come. According to the Department of Veterans Affairs, a significant percentage of combat veterans experience PTSD symptoms at some point after service. Numbers like that sound distant until you're lying awake at 3 a.m, staring at a ceiling, wondering why peace feels more dangerous than war ever did. Caleb tried to do everything right. He got out, found work in private security for a while, something close enough to the structure he understood. He married a woman who loved him fiercely and believed that love could be enough. For a while, it almost was. But trauma doesn't announce itself. It leaks. It slips into conversations. It shows up as silence where words should be, as anger that doesn't match the moment, as a constant readiness for impact. His marriage strained under the weight of a man who couldn't explain what was wrong because admitting it felt like failure. Eventually, it broke. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of quiet disappointments that added up to goodbye. The job went next. Private security contracts dried up. His concentration slipped. A missed detail here, a short fuse there. Employers don't always understand invisible injuries. Therapy was recommended, then postponed, then avoided. The drinking started small, just enough to quiet his thoughts at night, just enough to sleep. But alcohol, like trauma, doesn't stay in its lane. It spread, and when it did, everything else followed. By the time Caleb ended up in Vermont, his life had collapsed so thoroughly that disappearing felt less like a choice and more like gravity. He lost the house in the divorce. He sold what he could, packed what little mattered, and drove north until the noise inside his head finally matched the silence outside his window. The cabin came from an old teammate who'd retired early and said, without ceremony, "You need somewhere no one expects anything from you." Caleb took it because it felt like permission to stop pretending. That's the part most people don't understand about men like Caleb. They don't isolate because they hate people. They isolate because they don't trust themselves not to disappoint them. In the woods, no one asked him how he was doing. No one needed explanations. No one watched closely enough to notice the nights he didn't sleep or the days he barely ate. Out here, his collapse could happen quietly. He told himself this was healing, a reset. But healing doesn't mean absence, it means engagement. And Caleb wasn't engaging with anything except the bare minimum required to stay alive. He chopped wood. He boiled water. He went days without speaking. The radio stayed unplugged. The phone stayed face down. The bottle stayed within reach. This wasn't peace. It was a ceasefire with himself. The irony was cruel. He had survived ambushes, explosions, and floods in places most people would never see. But survival without meaning turned out to be heavier than any rucksack he'd ever carried. Studies on veteran reintegration talk about loss of identity as one of the most dangerous phases after service. When the uniform comes off, the clarity goes with it. You're no longer the guy with a role. You're just a man with memories, and no one tells you what to do with them. Caleb's memories came uninvited. A teammate pinned down under fire, a river swollen with rain where commands were shouted and lost to the noise. A hand slipping out of his grasp, not because he wasn't strong enough, but because sometimes strength isn't enough. Those moments replayed without warning, and each time a quiet voice followed them. You lived. They didn't. What are you doing with that? He didn't have an answer. That's why the knock on the door mattered more than he could have known in that moment. It didn't arrive as a grand revelation or a neatly packaged miracle. It arrived as work, as responsibility, as a choice that required him to stay awake, stay present, and stay sober enough to matter. The mother dog didn't care about his past. The puppies didn't care about his failures. They cared about warmth, about steadiness, about someone not turning away. There's a lesson buried here that rarely gets enough attention. We often think recovery starts when we feel better, but for many people, especially those carrying long-term trauma, it starts when something else needs them. Purpose doesn't always come from inside. Sometimes it's placed at your feet, trembling, asking nothing more than that you try. As Caleb watched the firelight flicker over the sleeping dogs, a realization settled in that made him uncomfortable. This wasn't a detour. This wasn't an interruption to his plan to disappear. This was a challenge to it. He could already feel the weight of what staying might require, calling for help, admitting he couldn't do everything alone, opening himself to loss again. Loving anything meant risking the pain of losing it. He had spent years avoiding that risk. But the storm outside didn't care about his history. It didn't care about his reasons. It just kept coming. And for the first time since leaving the teams, Caleb wasn't facing it alone. He wasn't leading men or following orders. He was sitting on the floor of a cabin, sharing warmth with a creature who had trusted him without knowing his name. This is where collapse quietly turns into possibility. Not because everything is suddenly okay, but because someone chooses to stay engaged when retreat would be easier. Caleb didn't know yet that this night would pull other people back into his orbit. He didn't know it would force him to ask for help, or that it would reopen parts of him he'd locked away for years. All he knew was that the man who had come to the mountains to vanish was still here, still breathing, still needed. And that was enough to keep the fire going. As the storm pressed on and the night deepened, Caleb leaned back against the wall, eyes open, listening to the sound of life around him. He wasn't healed, he wasn't fixed, but he was present. And sometimes, presence is the first act of courage a broken man can manage. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and relentless. Inside, something fragile but real had begun to take shape. The collapse had already happened. What came next would require something harder than survival. It would require him to rebuild. If you had asked Caleb Rourke years ago what logic looked like under pressure, he would have described checklists, hand signals, contingency plans. Logic was something clean, measured, designed to remove emotion from the equation. In the military, logic was what kept you alive when fear threatened to take over. You assessed the terrain, you calculated risk, you moved with purpose. Anything else got people killed. The mother dog lying near his fire that night followed a different kind of logic, but it was no less precise. Her name would later become Hope, but at that moment she was simply a creature running on instinct, sharpened by necessity. Out in the storm, she had not been searching for comfort. She had been searching for probability, warmth, shelter, stability. In extreme conditions, animals don't look for what feels safest. They look for what is most likely to last. And in the frozen Vermont mountains, where temperatures can drop dangerously low and storms erase familiar paths in hours, that kind of decision-making can mean the difference between life and death. Hope had passed other options on her way to Caleb's cabin. Fallen trees, shallow rock overhangs, snow-packed hollows that might hold heat for a night but collapse by morning. None of them carried the steady scent of fire, human presence, and structural protection. A wooden cabin did. Smoke does. Even to a dog that had likely learned to avoid people, those signals meant one thing: this place could hold. That is the first lesson of Hope's arrival, and it's one humans often resist. Survival is not about finding the perfect solution. It's about choosing the one that gives you the best odds and committing to it fully. Hope didn't hesitate once she made her choice. She moved forward, even though it meant approaching the unknown. Caleb watched her as she lay curled around her puppies, her body forming a barrier against the cold air that crept along the floor. Her sides rose and fell steadily now, but exhaustion clung to her like a second coat. He noticed the small details, the way her paws twitched even in rest, the way her ears stayed alert, angled toward every sound. This wasn't peace, this was vigilance. Mothers in crisis don't relax just because the danger pauses. What struck Caleb most was not her fear, but her restraint. She didn't hover over him. She didn't growl when he shifted closer to the fire. She watched, evaluated, measured his movements the same way she had measured the storm. Trust, he realized, was not something she gave freely. It was something she tested. In the wild, mother dogs operate on brutal efficiency. Energy is limited. Mistakes are fatal. Studies on canine maternal behavior show that stressed mothers prioritize warmth, proximity, and minimal disruption. Every unnecessary movement costs calories. Every decision must justify itself. Hope's repeated trips into the storm weren't acts of courage for courage's sake. They were calculated risks taken because the alternative, doing nothing, was certain death. Caleb recognized that mindset instantly. It mirrored the choices he'd made overseas. when waiting meant losing someone and moving meant gambling with your own life. You didn't go because you were fearless. You went because the cost of staying still was higher. As the night stretched on, Caleb found himself adjusting his behavior around her without thinking. He moved slowly. He kept his voice low. He made himself predictable. These were habits ingrained from years of working with men under stress, but they translated seamlessly to this moment. Trauma recognizes trauma. Calm recognizes calm. Without words, an agreement formed between them. No sudden moves, no unnecessary noise, no escalation. That's the second lesson hidden in this part of the story. Safety is not declared. It's demonstrated over and over again. In America, we often talk about trust as something emotional, something you feel. But in high-pressure environments, whether it's a battlefield, a disaster zone, or a blizzard, trust is behavioral. It's built through consistency, through doing what you said you would do, through not making things worse. Hope didn't trust Caleb because he was kind. She trusted him because he was steady. There was a moment, sometime after midnight, when one of the puppies let out a thin, desperate cry. Hope's head snapped up instantly. She nudged the pup closer to her belly, then glanced at Caleb, just briefly. Not a challenge, not a warning, a check. He stayed where he was, didn't reach, didn't interfere. Hope settled again, reassured. Another small deposit made into the account of trust. Caleb hadn't been trusted like that in a long time. For years, people had looked at him and seen risk, instability, a man who might react wrong at the wrong moment. His ex-wife had learned to read the signs of his withdrawal, embrace herself. Employers had noticed the edge beneath his silence. Even friends from the teams, the ones who understood him best, had drifted away when conversations became too heavy, too quiet, too loaded with things no one knew how to fix. But Hope didn't need him to be fixed. She needed him to be present. That distinction matters more than most people realize. When you're broken, being asked to heal can feel overwhelming. But being asked to help, really help, can feel possible. Purpose doesn't demand perfection. It demands participation. As the fire burned down and Caleb added another log, he became aware of something else shifting inside him. His usual background noise, the constant scanning for threats, the mental rehearsals of everything that could go wrong, had quieted. Not disappeared, but softened. His attention narrowed to the room, the warmth, the slow breathing of a mother and her litter. This is what psychologists sometimes call grounding, though in real life it doesn't feel clinical. It feels like being pulled back into your body after living in your head for too long. Hope's logic under pressure had done something remarkable. It had pulled Caleb into the present moment without asking his permission. There's another uncomfortable truth here, one that challenges the way we like to think about strength. Hope did not survive the storm by being dominant. She survived it by being adaptable. She changed plans. She approached something unfamiliar. She accepted help without surrendering agency. That kind of strength doesn't look impressive on the surface, but it's what endures. Humans, especially those raised to believe self-reliance is everything, struggle with this. We equate independence with isolation, as if needing help is a failure of character rather than a fact of biology. But no mammal survives alone for long. Not in winter, not under pressure, not when the stakes are this high. As dawn crept closer, pale light pressing faintly against the frost-covered windows, Hope finally allowed herself to sleep more deeply. Her muscles relaxed just enough to suggest that for now, the immediate danger had passed. Caleb sat nearby, back against the wall, eyes open. He hadn't slept, but he hadn't reached for the bottle either. That felt like its own quiet victory. He looked at the mother dog and understood something he'd never put into words before. Logic under pressure isn't about removing emotion. It's about prioritizing what matters most and letting everything else fall away. For Hope, that meant 8 fragile lives. For Caleb, he was beginning to realize it might mean his own. This night wasn't just about a dog choosing a cabin. It was about a man being chosen to re-enter the world, not through force or obligation, but through responsibility. The kind that doesn't shout, the kind that simply waits for you to show up. As the storm loosened its grip outside and the sky lightened, Caleb knew this wasn't the end of the crisis. It was the beginning of something more complicated. Caring always is. Soon, he would need help, supplies, knowledge he didn't have. He would need to call someone, to admit he couldn't do this alone. But that choice would come later. For now, Hope's logic had carried them through the worst of the night, and in the quiet that followed, with the fire still burning and life breathing steadily beside him, Caleb felt the smallest shift, an opening. Not wide enough to call hope yet, but wide enough to let something in. And sometimes, that's how everything changes. The blizzard did not ease with the coming hours. If anything, it grew more deliberate, as if the mountain itself had decided to test whatever dared to remain standing. Wind hammered the cabin walls in uneven bursts. Snow packed itself into every crack, every corner, every place warmth tried to escape. Outside, the world had narrowed to motion and noise. Inside, Caleb Rourke sat with his back against the wall, the fire at his side, and discovered that the louder storm was not the one clawing at the roof. It was the one he carried with him. At first, the memories came quietly, a sound layered over the wind, a rhythm beneath the howl. Rotor blades, not loud enough to fully form, but present enough to tighten his chest. Caleb closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, a habit drilled into him years ago. In for 4, hold, out for 6. He reminded himself where he was. Vermont, cabin, fire, dogs, safe. The words felt thin, like a mantra repeated too many times without conviction. Then the wind struck the cabin just right, hard, sudden, violent, and the line between past and present tore open. His heart rate spiked, his palms dampened, his vision tunneled. For a split second, the cabin was gone, replaced by concrete walls and broken light. He could smell dust and diesel, hear shouting, fragmented and urgent. His body prepared to move, to act, to do something useful. But there was nothing to do. No orders to follow, no one to cover, just a room, a fire, and a mother dog lifting her head sharply at the change in him. Caleb realized distantly that he was having a panic attack. This was the second storm, the one that didn't announce itself with snowfall or sirens, the one that lived in muscle memory and reflex, in a nervous system trained for danger and never taught how to stand down. According to trauma research, the body often learns fear faster than the mind learns safety. For veterans, this means that long after the war ends, the body continues to fight it anyway. Caleb knew this intellectually. Living it was something else entirely. He pressed his hands into the floor, grounding himself in the rough grain of the wood. The fire crackled. A puppy whimpered. Hope stood slowly, positioning herself between her litter and Caleb, not in aggression, but in awareness. She watched him closely now, ears forward, muscles engaged. This was not rejection. This was assessment. Something had changed in the environment, and she needed to understand what. Caleb forced himself to stay still. Here was the cruel paradox of trauma. The moment you need calm the most is the moment it feels least accessible. Every instinct told him to retreat, to shut down, to step outside and let the cold shock his system back into control. He had done that before. Ice had a way of cutting through panic, but leaving the cabin would mean abandoning the fire, the puppies, the fragile stability that had formed overnight. So he stayed. This is where the story turns, quietly but decisively, not with heroics, but with restraint. Caleb didn't conquer the storm inside him. He endured it. He let it pass through without letting it dictate his actions. In that moment, he chose something harder than escape. He chose presence. There's a lesson here that often gets lost in conversations about resilience. We talk about strength as if it means overpowering fear. In reality, strength often means allowing fear to exist without obeying it. Panic is not failure, it's information. The mistake is believing it has the authority to make decisions for you. Hope sensed the shift before Caleb fully did. She lowered her body slightly, no longer blocking, but watching. When he didn't move toward the door, didn't raise his voice, didn't escalate, her posture softened. Slowly, she lay back down beside her puppies, though her eyes remained open. Trust, once tested, does not return automatically. It is rebuilt moment by moment. Caleb exhaled shakily. The worst of the panic ebbed, leaving behind exhaustion and a familiar ache, part relief, part shame. He hated that this still happened. Hated that after everything he'd survived, something as simple as wind could reduce him to this. But another thought followed, quieter and more dangerous. I stayed. That mattered. Outside, the blizzard roared on, indifferent to human struggle. Inside, the fire held. The puppies slept. Hope kept watch. Caleb leaned his head back against the wall, eyes open, letting the aftermath wash through him. His hands trembled slightly, but they were empty. No bottle, no phone, no exit strategy, just time. For years, Caleb had believed that his war defined him because it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. What no one told him was that living afterward could be harder. Combat had rules. Survival afterward was ambiguous. There were no clear objectives, no end dates, no guarantees. Just choices, repeated daily, that either built a life or eroded it. Tonight, the choice had been simple but profound. Stay. The storm outside eventually shifted, its fury breaking into uneven waves. Snow still fell, but the wind loosened its grip. Dawn was still hours away, but something had changed. The cabin felt less like a bunker and more like a shelter. Not because the danger was gone, but because it was being faced. Caleb rose quietly and added another log to the fire. The flames caught, light spilling across the room. Hope lifted her head, watching him. He met her gaze and without thinking, spoke softly. It's okay, he said, not to calm her, to calm himself. The words hung in the air, fragile but real. This is the third lesson of the storm. Safety is not the absence of threat. It's the presence of care. Many people believe that healing requires perfect conditions, quiet minds, calm environments, problems neatly resolved. In truth, healing often begins in the middle of chaos, when someone chooses to respond differently than they have before. Caleb didn't become a new man that night. He didn't shed his past or silence his memories, but he learned something critical. He could feel the storm inside him and still be useful. That realization changes things. As the hours passed, Caleb found himself thinking not about escape, but about logistics. The puppies would need food. Hope would need water and calories to recover. He didn't have enough supplies. This wasn't a problem he could solve alone. The thought made his stomach tighten, but it didn't paralyze him. For the first time, asking for help felt less like weakness and more like strategy. He remembered an older woman who lived down the road, Mrs. June Halloway. She checked on him once after a heavy snowfall, left a note when he didn't answer. He'd ignored it then. Tonight, the memory surfaced with new weight. There were also rescue centers, vets, people who knew more than he did. The idea of involving others scared him, but not as much as the idea of failing these animals. Outside, the storm finally began to fade into a steady fall. Inside, the second storm had passed its peak. Caleb sat down again, closer to Hope and her litter than before. She didn't move away. That felt like an unspoken acknowledgement, not full trust, but progress. As dawn approached, pale light pressing against the frost-lined windows, Caleb felt the exhaustion settle into his bones. It was the honest kind, earned and heavy. He hadn't slept, but he hadn't hidden either. The war inside him was still there, quiet but unresolved. Yet for the first time in years, it didn't feel like it was winning. Two storms had come through the night, one of snow and wind, visible and loud, the other of memory and fear, invisible and relentless. Both had tested the structure holding them together, and both, somehow, had been endured. When the light finally crept across the floor, Caleb knew this was no longer just about surviving the night. What came next would require action, humility, and the willingness to bring others into a life he had spent years shutting down. The blizzard had shown him what staying cost. The war inside him had shown him what running cost. And between those two truths, a path forward had begun to form. Morning arrived slowly, as if the mountain itself needed time to recover. The storm had loosened its grip, leaving behind a thick, muffled quiet that settled over the forest like a held breath. Pale light filtered through the frost-covered windows of Caleb Rourke's cabin, revealing the evidence of a long night's snow tracked across the floor, logs burned down to glowing embers, and 9 small lives curled together near the fire. Hope lay wrapped around her puppies, eyes half closed but alert, her body still carrying the responsibility of vigilance, even in rest. Caleb hadn't slept. He sat at the small table with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the steady rise and fall of Hope's chest. The panic from the night before had faded into a dull ache, replaced by something heavier, awareness. He could no longer pretend this was a temporary interruption. These animals needed more than warmth and good intentions. They needed food, medical care, and knowledge he didn't have. For years, Caleb's solution to most problems had been isolation. This time, isolation wasn't an option. The radio crackled suddenly, startling him. He hadn't plugged it in weeks. Static hissed, then a familiar voice cut through, calm and firm. "Caleb, it's June. I know you don't usually answer, but I'm calling anyway. Roads are rough, but I left something on your porch. Don't let it freeze." He stared at the radio for a long moment before standing. When he opened the door, the cold bit at his face, but the storm had softened. Sitting by the steps was a woven basket, half buried in snow. Inside were a loaf of bread, canned soup, a sack of dog food, and a folded note sealed in plastic. June Holloway had never been a woman of unnecessary words, and the note reflected that. "You don't have to do this alone, but you do have to do it right." That sentence landed with weight. June wasn't offering to take over. She wasn't asking questions or demanding explanations. She was offering support with limits, kindness with boundaries, the kind that respects dignity instead of replacing it. Caleb carried the basket inside, set it down, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, but permission. This is the first lesson the village brings. Real help doesn't erase responsibility, it reinforces it. In American culture, we often imagine community support as rescue, someone swooping in to fix things when we can't. But healthy communities don't work that way. They show up, provide resources, and expect you to stay engaged. June wasn't here to save Caleb. She was here to make sure he didn't fail quietly. Later that morning, the sound of tires crunching on snow announced another arrival. A dark green SUV pulled into the clearing, its tires fighting the last remnants of ice. A woman stepped out, bundled in a thick coat, her movements efficient and unhurried. Dr. Nina Hart didn't knock when she reached the porch. She waited, giving the space the respect it deserved. Inside, Hope lifted her head when Nina knelt beside her, but she didn't growl. She watched. Nina spoke softly, her voice steady and practiced. She let Hope sniff her gloved hand before touching her, and when she did, her movements were slow, deliberate, and precise. She checked the puppies one by one, listening, observing, making notes. "They're underweight," she said finally, "but they're fighters. Mild dehydration, nothing we can't manage if we're careful." Caleb listened closely, absorbing every word. This wasn't a lecture. It was a collaboration. Nina explained what she was doing and why, how hypothermia shows up in young pups, why gradual warming mattered, how feeding too much too fast could do more harm than good. She talked about calories, hydration, and stress, grounding the miracle of survival in practical reality. This is the second lesson of the village. Compassion without competence can be dangerous. Good intentions alone don't save lives. Knowledge does. Training does. And knowing when to defer to someone with more experience is not weakness, it's leadership. Caleb had spent years in environments where mistakes cost lives. He recognized professionalism when he saw it. Nina wasn't emotional about the puppies. She was invested. There's a difference. They stepped outside to talk about next steps. Nina suggested building a temporary shelter near the porch, open enough that Hope wouldn't feel trapped, but protected from wind and snow. The choice has to be hers, she said. If she moves them, it means she trusts the space. If she doesn't, we adjust. Caleb nodded. He understood that principle deeply. In combat, forcing movement too soon could get people killed. Readiness wasn't something you demanded. It was something you earned. They worked side by side for hours, cutting wood, laying straw, reinforcing weak points. Nina's hands were steady, her focus complete. She didn't ask about Caleb's past. She didn't probe. She respected the work in front of them. And in that shared labor, something subtle shifted. Caleb wasn't being managed or monitored. He was contributing. There's another lesson here, quieter but just as important. Dignity comes from being useful. Many people struggling with trauma don't need to be fixed. They need to be included. They need roles that matter. Purpose is not therapy, but it often opens the door to it. June returned that afternoon, moving carefully up the path with a thermos in hand. She surveyed the scene, the shelter taking shape, the dogs resting inside, the supplies stacked neatly by the wall. "Looks like you're learning to accept help," she said dryly. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation. "I'm learning to use it," Caleb replied. June smiled at that. "That's better." She didn't stay long. She never did. Her presence was brief but intentional. Before she left, she paused and looked at Hope, then back at Caleb. "You take care of them," she said, "but don't forget to take care of yourself. Running on empty doesn't make you noble. It just makes you unreliable." It was a hard truth, delivered without cruelty. As evening settled in, Caleb stood on the porch, watching Hope make her decision. One by one, she carried her puppies into the new shelter, arranging them carefully in the straw. When she finally lay down among them, her body relaxed in a way it hadn't since the storm began. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. This is the third lesson of the village. Trust grows where effort meets support. Hope trusted the shelter because it was well built. Caleb trusted the process because he wasn't doing it alone. Nina trusted Caleb because he listened. June trusted him because he showed up. None of this happened by accident. It happened because each person involved respected both the limits and the strengths of the others. That night, as the temperature dropped again, Caleb sat by the fire and thought about how different this felt from the isolation he'd chosen before. The cabin was still quiet. The mountains were still vast and indifferent. But he wasn't alone inside himself anymore. There were voices now, plans, responsibilities that extended beyond his own survival. He also knew this was fragile. One mistake, one bad night, one moment of withdrawal could undo progress. Community is not a cure, it's a commitment. It requires showing up again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. As he prepared to sleep, really sleep, for the first time in days, Caleb understood that the hardest part wasn't over. Caring would bring loss. Trust would bring risk. The village wouldn't always be gentle. Boundaries meant accountability, and accountability meant change. But for the first time since his life had collapsed, change didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a path. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and steady. Inside, the fire burned on. Hope and her puppies slept in their shelter, safe for now. And Caleb, wrapped in the quiet strength of a community that had shown up without taking over, allowed himself to rest. The village had arrived. What came next would test everything they had built together. The trouble didn't announce itself loudly. It never does. It arrived the way real danger often does, quietly, almost politely, in the early hours before dawn, when the world feels suspended between night and morning. Caleb Rourke noticed it because he had learned, long ago, to read small changes. A shift in breathing, a rhythm that didn't match the rest. The smallest puppy lay slightly apart from the others, her tiny chest fluttering instead of rising. Each breath seemed to cost her more than the last. Her body felt cool to the touch, even wrapped in straw and warmth. Caleb crouched beside the shelter, heart sinking, instincts firing all at once. Hypothermia, dehydration, failure to thrive. He had heard the words the day before when Dr. Nina Hart explained the risks, but hearing them and facing them were two very different things. Hope noticed too. The mother dog lifted her head, eyes sharp, scanning her litter. She nudged the pup gently, then again, harder this time. The puppy let out a weak sound, more air than voice, and went still. Hope didn't panic. She didn't whine. Instead, she did something that made Caleb's throat tighten so suddenly he had to look away. She picked up the fading pup and carried her to him. Not toward the fire, not back into the shelter, to him. Hope placed the tiny body at Caleb's feet and stepped back, her amber eyes locked on his face. There was no fear in them, no pleading, only certainty. She had made a decision, and with it, she handed over responsibility. It felt exactly like being past a wounded soldier. In combat, there's a moment when someone places another human into your arms. Not gently, not ceremoniously, but with urgency and trust. It says everything without words. I can't do this alone. You take him. Don't drop him. Caleb hadn't felt that weight in years. The memory hit him hard enough to steal his breath. His hands trembled as he scooped the puppy up, cradling her against his chest. She was impossibly light, fragile. He could feel her heartbeat, faint and irregular, like it was deciding whether to stay or go. Panic surged, sharp and familiar. The old voice rose instantly. You're going to lose her. You always do. This is the first lesson of the fading pup. Trauma doesn't wait for permission. It shows up when the stakes are highest. Caleb forced himself to breathe. He remembered Nina's words. Warmth first, gradual, no shock. He carried the puppy inside, laid her on a towel near the fire, and wrapped her carefully. Hope followed, stopping just inside the doorway, watching every movement. She didn't interfere. She didn't retreat. She stood like a commander outside a field hospital, waiting for news. Caleb fumbled with the heating pad he dug out of a closet, the one he'd used on his shoulder years ago. He set it on the lowest setting, layered towels between it and the puppy's skin. His movements were clumsy, hands stiff with fear and cold. He hated this part, the not knowing, the helplessness. It reminded him too much of other nights, other losses. When Dr. Nina arrived less than an hour later, the sky was just beginning to lighten. She took one look at the puppy and went straight to work. No dramatics, no wasted motion. She checked the pup's temperature, heart rate, gums. She's fading, Nina said quietly, but she's not gone. Those words mattered more than she knew. They worked together in silence at first. Nina guided him through warming techniques, showed him how to rub tiny circles along the puppy's chest to stimulate breathing. She drew up a small syringe of warmed formula, feeding drop by drop, careful not to overwhelm her. Slow, she reminded him. Too fast can shut her down. Hope stayed close, pacing once, then settling near Caleb's knee. When he reached out instinctively, she didn't flinch. She leaned into his leg, solid and warm, as if anchoring him to the moment. This is the second lesson of the fading pup. Trust can be terrifying when you're afraid of failing. Hope had given him something sacred, her weakest, and with it came the risk of heartbreak. Many people avoid responsibility not because they don't care, but because they care too much to survive losing again. Caleb had lived that way for years, keeping his world small enough that nothing could be taken from him. Now that strategy was gone. A life rested in his hands, and there was no safe distance left. Hours passed in measured actions and whispered encouragement. Nina checked vitals. Caleb held the puppy against his chest, letting his body heat do what machines couldn't. At one point, exhaustion washed over him so suddenly he had to sit down. His head dropped forward, shoulders shaking. "It feels like holding a heartbeat that's trying to escape," he murmured. Nina didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was gentle but firm. "That's because you are. But here's the difference this time. You're not running, you're staying." The words cut through him. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft but relentless. Inside, the fire crackled, steady and patient. Hope lifted her head every time the puppy made a sound, then settled again when Nina nodded. They were a team now, whether any of them had planned it or not. There's a third lesson here, one that challenges a deeply American belief. Self-reliance is not the same as strength. We grow up hearing that needing help means weakness, that the strongest people stand alone. But in crisis, isolation kills. Cooperation saves. No soldier survives without a unit. No animal raises young alone. No human heals without connection. Sometime after midnight, the puppy stirred. Her breathing deepened, uneven but stronger. She let out a tiny sound, barely audible, but unmistakably alive. Nina smiled for the first time in hours. "She's fighting," she said. Caleb swallowed hard. "So am I," he replied. They didn't celebrate, not yet. Survival is cautious like that. They stayed with her through the night, monitoring, adjusting, waiting. When dawn finally broke, pale light spilling across the floor, the puppy's eyes fluttered open. Just a sliver, just long enough to decide. Hope rose immediately and stepped forward. Nina moved aside without a word. The mother sniffed her pup, then looked at Caleb. Slowly, deliberately, she licked his hand once. Warm, steady, complete. Something broke open in him then. The tears came without warning, not sharp or loud, but deep and unstoppable. His shoulders shook as years of restrained grief finally found a release. This wasn't about the puppy alone. It was about every moment he'd been trusted before and believed he'd failed. Every life he'd carried and lost. Every door he'd closed to avoid this feeling. This time, the ending was different. Nina looked away, giving him space. Hope stayed close, her head resting against his knee, breath slow and real. When Caleb finally wiped his face and looked up, the world felt altered, not fixed, but softer, as if the edges had been sanded down just enough to breathe. This is the fourth lesson of the fading pup. Healing often begins with grief, not joy. We want recovery to feel triumphant, clean, uplifting, but more often it feels like mourning what was lost and accepting what remains. Caleb wasn't healed that morning, he was opened, and opening hurts. As the sun climbed higher, Nina packed her things, leaving instructions and reassurance behind. "She'll need monitoring," she said, "but she has a chance now." She paused, then added, "You did good." Those words landed differently than praise ever had before. They weren't about competence, they were about presence. Caleb carried the puppy back to the shelter, placing her gently beside her siblings. Hope curled around them all, her body forming the same living wall it had built on the first night. But this time, Caleb didn't step back into the shadows. He stayed close, watching, breathing, letting the moment anchor him. The storm outside would return again. Life would test them again. Loss would still be possible. But something fundamental had shifted. Trust had been given. Trust had been honored. And in that exchange, A man who once believed he was only good at surviving had taken his first real step toward living. What came next would push that fragile progress even further. Spring didn't arrive all at once in the Vermont mountains. It never does. It came the way healing often does, unevenly, almost cautiously. Snow pulled back from the earth in patches, revealing dark soil and thin blades of green that looked too fragile to survive. The river that had once threatened everything ran clearer now, steady instead of violent, reflecting light instead of swallowing it. The air smelled different, softer, like something unfinished but hopeful. By early March, Caleb Rourke's cabin no longer felt like a place someone hid. It felt like a place where things happened. On the porch, chaos unfolded in the best possible way. 8 German Shepherd puppies, now all legs and oversized paws, tumbled over one another in the weak spring sun. One dragged a stick twice his size across the yard, determined and ridiculous. Another barked at her own reflection in a puddle, startled every time it barked back. Their energy filled the space that had once been ruled by silence. Hope lay nearby, stretched out on the porch boards, eyes half closed but never truly resting. Her body was stronger now, her coat thick and glossy. Every so often she lifted her head to nudge a pup back from the edge of the steps, or let out a low bark when one strayed too far. She wasn't anxious anymore. She was confident. This place had become hers. Caleb watched them with a mug of coffee warming his hands, a small smile settling in without effort. For a long time, joy had felt like something he needed to earn or justify. Now it arrived quietly, unannounced, and stayed as long as he didn't push it away. That was the first lesson after the storm. Joy doesn't demand permission. It asks for space. Dr. Nina Hart arrived late that morning, her SUV kicking up mud instead of snow as it pulled into the clearing. She stepped out with supplies in one hand and a grin that matched the weather. The puppies swarmed her boots instantly, tails wagging, teeth nipping playfully at her laces. Healthy, she said after checking them one by one. Curious, exactly what they should be. Caleb helped hold them steady as she gave vaccinations, his hands gentle but sure. Nina noticed the change immediately. The rigid caution was gone. In its place was ease, not carelessness, but trust in his own strength. "You've gotten good at this," she said. He shrugged. "They taught me." Inside the cabin, the walls looked different now. Where there had once been bare wood and shadows, there were photographs, each puppy with a new family, a handwritten note beneath every frame. "He sleeps with my son every night. She's training as a therapy dog. We didn't know how much we needed him." Letting them go hadn't been easy. That was the second lesson. Loving well means releasing well. For someone like Caleb, goodbye had always felt like failure, loss, proof that attachment was dangerous. But watching the puppies leave one by one, healthy and confident, had taught him something new. Endings didn't have to mean collapse. Sometimes they meant success. Hope stayed. She had options. Nina made sure of that. Good homes, open land, families who would have welcomed her. Hope chose the cabin. She chose Caleb. Not because she needed him to survive anymore, but because she belonged. June Halloway visited that afternoon, carrying a pie wrapped in foil. "Apple," she said simply. "Tradition." They sat together on the porch steps, watching Hope doze while the last of the puppies wrestled in the yard. June stirred her tea slowly. "You've built something here," she said. "Not just for them." Caleb nodded. He felt it too. The routines, the responsibilities, the people who now showed up and expected him to show up in return. Healing hadn't erased his past. It had integrated it. That was the third lesson. Building a life that can hold joy means building one that can also hold pain, without letting either define you completely. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the melting snow into ribbons of gold, Caleb sat at his desk with a piece of scrap wood and his old pocket knife. He carved slowly, deliberately, letting the act ground him. When he was finished, he nailed the sign above the porch. Stay, not as a command, as a reminder. Hope rested her head against his leg when he sat beside her breath deep and content. The air buzzed faintly with insects, a sound Caleb hadn't heard in years. Life, returning. Months passed, summer followed, then fall. When the first snow of the new year arrived, it did so gently, like an old friend who no longer needed to shout. The mountains hushed again, but this time the silence wasn't empty, it was full. On that morning, Caleb stood by the window, buttoning a Navy working uniform he hadn't worn in nearly a year. The fabric felt heavier than he remembered, not with regret, but with distance. He didn't put it on because he missed who he had been. He put it on to honor how far he'd come. Behind him, the cabin glowed with warmth. Hope stood at his side, her muzzle brushing his knee. Her amber eyes lifted to his face, steady and patient. Outside, the porch waited, dusted with fresh snow. A familiar green SUV pulled into the clearing. Then June's old sedan. Nina stepped out first, bundled against the cold, smiling when she saw him. "You wore it," she said. "Felt like the right day," Caleb replied. They stood together for a moment, watching Hope step into the snow, her paws leaving a clean trail beside his boot prints. June's voice broke the quiet gently. "Not everyone who leaves the battlefield ever finds peace again," she said. "But you did." Caleb looked at the mountains, their peaks bright against the pale sky. "I didn't find it," he said. "I built it, with help." That was the final lesson of the storm, and the most important one of all. Home is not a place you hide in. It's something you create through care, through courage, through choosing connection over isolation, again and again. Hope leaned into him. Nina laughed softly as a snowflake landed on the dog's nose, making her sneeze. Caleb's laughter followed, unguarded and real. He opened the door and gestured inside. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go home." The porch creaked as they turned. Snow fell behind them, covering their footprints. But the path they had built, through storms, through trust, through community, would remain. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. They come quietly, in the form of responsibility, of kindness with boundaries, of a life once collapsed, rebuilt strong enough to hold joy. And sometimes all it takes to begin is the courage to open the door and then stay. If this story reminded you of someone, send it to them.